Germany, the country that has led the European economy and investment in renewable energy, is unable to break its dependence on fossil fuels and is increasing its consumption of coal to mitigate an energy crisis that could last much longer than expected, compromising its industry and the environment while its citizens bought wood to prepare for the winter and discontent with the government is increasing. In 1990, the Democratic Republic of Germany joined the Federal Republic of Germany after more than 4 decades of a division that originated with the end of the Second World War and was the protagonist of the Cold War, with the western side being occupied by the United States, the United Kingdom, and France, the eastern side by the Soviet Union and Berlin equally divided. Initially without restrictions on passage from one side of the city to the other, but eventually with the Berlin Wall, built by the Soviet Union, in the middle, a symbol of separation that would fall into the hands of the citizens in 1989, a year before the official reunification. And although it was a slow process, Germany managed to reunify with the western side, which at that time was the 4th largest economy in the world, marking the development of the East. Germany would also count on its historical enemies as allies, the protection of NATO, cheap gas from Russia, and an educated and prepared labor force that will continue to grow in the 21st century and avoid falling into stagnation like Japan. In addition, it would manage to become one of the most prosperous economies in the world, ranking 3rd in exports and with a huge automotive industry made up of Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, BMW, and Audi, among other recognized brands, BASF, which is the largest chemical producer in the world, and Siemens, the largest industrial manufacturing company in Europe, among many others. And to maintain this golden age in its history, Germany would focus on strengthening the European Union, seek to limit U.S. influence on domestic affairs, and use trade ties with Russia as a way to avoid any future conflict. Germany would also be one of the countries that would invest the most in the energy transition, with large investments in renewable energy. And although the intention was good and this investment sought to reduce CO2 emissions, where Germany, as can be expected from the size of its economy, is one of the 10 largest polluters in the world, this transition is not so simple. The main problem with this type of energy is that it is intermittent. Sometimes the sun does not shine and sometimes there is no wind. And therefore, in its current version, and until batteries or alternatives such as green hydrogen are developed and scalable, backup generation sources are needed, able to be in operation all the time or that can be turned on and off as needed. This position is usually filled by hydroelectric, nuclear, and thermoelectric plants, which use gas, coal, or oil to generate electrical power. And Germany would choose coal and gas as its main backup source, even though it would generate a lot of CO2 compared to nuclear power, which generates virtually nothing, and would begin a process to decommission its nuclear power plants, accelerated after the disaster from Fukushima. At the moment, there are only 3 left, and they could close in 2023 when the winter ends. And the fossil fuels used as backup were mainly imported from Russia, from where in 2021 it imported 45% of coal, 55% of natural gas, and 35% of oil. And Angela Merkel, who was chancellor for most of this period, delivered great results, managing to maintain growth internally and the stability of the European Union externally. And despite maintaining a high dependence on fossil fuels and Russia, German industry will develop thanks to a highly competitive cost structure while reducing the country's CO2 emissions. But what on the surface was industrial and environmental prosperity had several complex structural problems behind it, which would begin to detonate with the arrival of his successor Olaf Scholz.
Обстоятельства требуют от нас решительных и незамедлительных действий. Мною принято решение о проведении специальной военной операции.
Russia's invasion of Ukraine would reveal a series of weaknesses in Germany's energy system, compromising its industry. And Germany had to make one of the most complex decisions in its recent history. Stay industrialized, but antagonize your Western allies or face the consequences of sanctioning Russia and running out of energy. The choice is known by all. The European Union condemned the invasion, considering it unjustified, and together with the United States, Japan, Canada, Singapore, South Korea, among others, imposed a strong package of sanctions on Russia, in addition to supporting Ukraine militarily and with resources. And Russia, in retaliation, cut off gas supplies to Germany, which were made through the Nordstream 1 pipeline. The effects were immediate, and the costs of electricity, which had been on average 40 euros per megawatt in 2019 and 2020, reached 700 euros, an increase of 1,650% in less than 2 years, for then they will remain around 200 euros. This has forced the government to approve aid packages to subsidize energy for individuals and companies, which were forced to cut their demand to the maximum due to the high costs. And in the midst of a global crisis where the world is experiencing its worst inflation in recent decades, and companies are improving as they are affected by interruptions in supply chains, the European energy crisis ended up worsening an already difficult situation for people and for German industry. And Germany, an exporting country, saw its trade balance enter negative territory for the first time in 30 years. So for the first time in 30 years, they imported more than they exported, with China and the United States, their main export destinations, observing a slowdown in their economy and demanding less.
The Germans have to have a plan because they don't have any of it local. So what they do is they cut deals with the Russians to bring natural gas in at large volumes and reasonable prices. That provides not just the basis for their entire electricity sector, but also their entire manufacturing sector, because that natural gas is processed into petrochemical goods, which are then the basis of manufacturing. So if something happens to the natural gas flows, the entire German manufacturing model fails. Now, back on September 1, the Russians cut off supplies through the Nord Stream pipeline, excuse me, and told the Germans publicly that until you cease participating in the NATO coalition supporting Ukraine, and until you lift all sanctions, we're not turning this back on. This was 40% of their supply. And that meant that the Germans had to replace that 40% with marginal suppliers, and so natural gas prices in Germany have gone through the roof to the point that it's no longer economically viable to generate electricity or the petrochemicals that undergird their entire economic model. The Russians basically told the Germans, you can be modern and industrialized and neutral, or you can choose to be Western and lose everything. And the Germans went with option B. And now that Nord Stream has been blown up, there's no going back, even if we had a government shift in Germany and Russia today. So we are looking at nothing less than the complete collapse of the German manufacturing model in just the next year or two.
And in order to cover Russia's gas shortage, Germany has been forced to resort to higher demand for coal and has insisted on ruling out nuclear power because the pollution is important unless it's solvable with nuclear power. In this case, the industry is important and a lot of coal can be burned. And Europe has been importing liquefied gas from the United States, Qatar, and Australia. The problem is that this gas can cost 3 to 5 times more than the gas they usually buy and requires infrastructure that is currently not on a sufficient scale and can take 3 to 5 years to build. And the cost structure for their industry will still be very different than it was when they built their industry. And during the winter, if the gas reserves that the country has been accumulating are exhausted, priority will be given to homes, as it should be, to avoid as many deaths as possible due to cold, where the elderly can be extremely vulnerable. This is how German industry went from having low energy costs to extremely high costs, running the risk of blackouts in the coming months and, in the case of the manufacturing and chemical industries, losing natural gas, which is an essential raw material in its production process. This is why companies such as BASF, Prysmian, ArcelorMittal, or Tesla have begun to consider transferring part of their operations to other countries because they simply cannot operate under current conditions or consolidate competitiveness, especially considering that production of so many industries in Germany such as paper, aluminum, cement, or chemical products, for example, requires a lot of energy, and at current prices it is not practical to continue operating them.
Between January 2021 and January 2023, the price of electricity will have been multiplied by 22 and gas by 18. In these conditions, our production lines are worthless. If we maintain production, our energy costs could represent up to 40% of our turnover, which is untenable.
I think we urgently need a Europe-wide industrial electricity price that would stabilize the situation for our industry. But of course, that's not something you can develop and roll out within a couple of weeks, so it's not going to work unless there's emergency aid.
Actually, up to now, there's been no support at all from the state. We've applied for support for the high energy prices, but the application was extremely bureaucratic, and it almost seems as if obstacles were being deliberately put in the way so that as few companies as possible could receive support.
All this reveals that Germany's apparently successful energy transition is actually completely dependent on fossil fuels, especially coal, cannot guarantee competitive costs for its industry now that they do not have Russian gas, and could suffer blackouts in the coming months, resulting in the exodus of some companies and the bankruptcy of others. And some companies are planning to migrate to countries where they can get power reliably, one of them being the United States, which enacted the Inflation Reduction Act to lower inflation and is subsidizing the creation of industrial companies in the country. Spending to stop inflation is completely absurd, and studies have considered this plan to have no effect in this regard, but in the midst of what is happening in Europe, it has become extremely attractive to some companies. Because even if the war ended today, Russia would not be able to fully restore gas supplies to Germany because on September 26th, Nordstream's gas pipelines suffered a sabotage that could take more than a year to be repaired, with the possibility that it will not be possible to do so, and a fact that the Swedish authorities are investigating, but with Russia accusing the United Kingdom of having caused this attack. The West accusing Russia, and with the former Minister of Foreign Relations of Poland thanking the United States. And while Germany does have options, virtually all of them are long-term or politically impossible for now. In the long term, it can establish the necessary facilities to receive liquefied natural gas, although of course with the extra costs, it also can import natural gas from Norway, which has been trying to increase its capacity to meet the demand of Europe, and can continue to increase its investments in renewable energy capacity. Although this does not solve the underlying problem that is backup power generation, it is very likely that it is one of the options that they will implement. On the politically unacceptable side, there is taking advantage of the gas that it has in Lower Saxony in the northwest of the country, which requires fracking, which is prohibited in Germany, although it has returned to the discussion due to the emergency. It also can increasing the nuclear power generation capacity, but this option, in addition to being politically unacceptable, can take a long time to start operating. This makes it very likely that German industry will look very differently by the time it does solve its energy problem, if it does, especially considering that it is not the only one it is up against. And if you think that there are already many problems, what did you expect? That the industry of one of the most resilient countries in history fell easily? But before I tell you about this, remember to subscribe and share this video if you have found this information useful. Like many European countries, Germany suffers from an aging population that is projected to decline rapidly over the next few years. This is its population pyramid for 2020. The first thing you might notice is that it doesn't look like a pyramid at all. The second thing you might notice is that the people who make up the largest group of the population are in their 50s and 60s. These are the people responsible for the development of the country, and they will not only start retiring in the next 10 years, but they will leave vacancies that cannot be covered by the following, much smaller generations. This will translate into greater difficulty to find young workers in the country, putting more pressure on an affected industry. It will also generate higher costs to support retirees, because now there will be fewer people working for each retired person, and as the population falls, it will imply a lower internal demand that will have to be covered with more exports, in the midst of a loss of competitiveness due to the increase in energy costs and loss of skilled labor. This is how the country that has managed to cope with the loss of the First World War, the hyperinflation of the Weimar Republic, its almost total destruction during the Second World War and still overcome it, could enter into a huge stagnation of its economy with its industrial sector migrating to other countries and its economy remaining a shadow of what it once was. And do you think that German industry will be able to overcome this crisis? I would like to know your opinion. Until next time.